Okay, now I'm getting to the second and much longer portion of your test, which is image-based questions. There are only 19 general multiple choice questions, as I mentioned in my last podcast. There are 71 image-based questions. So at any rate, to start out with, I'm sure you will all recognize the bronze image on the left, but what's the image on the right? So I'll give you a hint, and actually the College Board tells you this as well. These sculptures were created by the same sculptor. Likewise, both sculptures exhibit what similar quality. Another hint, think about the stance that each figure exhibits. You know that term. In what city were both sculptures created? The nudity of the figure on the left harks back to what era? And whom does this statue represent? Again, these are not hard. What about the figure on the right? Who is he? I think this one's trickier. So is this. Who commissioned the figure on the right? That is the marble and not the bronze. Okay, this is actually a different set of questions. You have one image that remains the same, but you have a different image that goes with it. You've probably guessed that the College Board really likes that bronze statue on the left. This is, in my view, the easiest set of image questions I have ever seen on an AP test. But here goes anyway. The figure on the left, the one in bronze, was sculpted by whom? Both sculptures depict whom? Both figures were produced where? The pose of these figures goes by what term? You notice some similarities, by the way, between that last set of questions and this one. Different tests, same College Board preoccupations. How do both figures differ from medieval statuary? And both sculptures recall works from what earlier era? Those are all, I think, easy questions, somewhat repetitive. This one's a little tougher. What element makes the marble sculpture innovative? In other words, how does the sculptor choose to depict this subject and actually many of his subjects a little differently? What dramatic technique does he use? I talked about this in my podcast, and it's in the Khan Academy podcast and your textbook as well. Also, while the marble sculpture is now in a museum where it was originally placed, despite Leonardo da Vinci, where was it originally placed despite Leonardo da Vinci's best efforts to keep it low profile? Again, I think these questions are for the most part free gifts from the College Board. We should get so lucky in May. Okay, this one shouldn't be too tough either. Who painted this famous picture? And it dates toward the end of which century? Now, careful here. Remember what I said in my last podcast about keeping your early and high Renaissance artists and centuries straight. That's important. Who was the patron of this work? Who is the central figure in the painting? That is the naked lady standing on the cockle shell. Her pose is derived from what earlier source? I did talk about that in the podcast. What made this central figure innovative for her time? The painting was noteworthy for its, and you're going to be filling in the blank. I'll give you some hints here. This one's a little trickier. Recall that unlike many early Renaissance painters, Botticelli was not especially interested in mathematical perspective, in geometry, in the natural sciences, except perhaps botany. Remember how accurately many of those flowers in Primavera were portrayed. But at any rate, he was clearly a master of line. So with all of those hints, I don't think you'll find it hard to identify the correct answer. Actually, I don't think you'd find it hard anyway. Who denounced this and other Florentine paintings and actually persuaded Botticelli to destroy some of his works? Now, there's one more question about this work. It's one that I thought was difficult, as it asks about a point that was not mentioned in your textbook. It came up in the video on Botticelli, but a lot of things came up in the video on Botticelli. So here's the question. What school of thought may have influenced Botticelli? Actually, as you may recall, there's a lot of debate over the philosophical meaning of this painting and also of Primavera. But some scholars believe that these paintings reflect Neoplatonism. You may recall that the Medici Academy was called the Platonic Academy, and part of the revived interest in Greek learning was a revived interest in Plato. So here's a summary from, and I'm going to make this confession, Wikipedia, about the Platonic or Neoplatonic elements in this work. For Plato and for so many members of the Florentine Platonic Academy, Venus had two aspects. She was an earthly goddess who aroused humans to physical love, or she was a heavenly goddess who inspired intellectual love. Plato further argued that contemplating physical beauty allowed the mind to better understand spiritual beauty. So looking at Venus, the most beautiful of goddesses, might first raise a physical response and then would lift their minds toward the creator. A Neoplatonic reading of Botticelli's Birth of Venus suggests that 15th century viewers would have looked at the painting and felt their minds lifted to the realm of divine love. Maybe yes, maybe no, but you should have plenty of information now if you're listening to this podcast to get that question right. Okay. Interestingly, you're not asked to identify the painter or the name of, well, you're kind of asked to identify the name of the painting. I recommend it's one you know because it's a College Board favorite. But the first question about this is, what elements of this painting recall the International Gothic style? And remember, we've encountered the International Gothic both in the last unit and this one. And think about the sort of upper class elements that characterize that. What kind of architecture shows up in the painting? And by the way, this is a little hard, but here's my hint. Note the loggia in particular. That's that sort of colonnaded open area. The garden calls to mind what kind of medieval art? I'm going to give you a hint here. Embroidery is involved. And finally, what is the subject matter of the painting, which is actually also its title? And again, the College Board doesn't ask for the painter, but I do really recommend you know this one. Okay, you all recognize this famous structure, right? A little blurry in this, sorry. Who designed it and supervised its construction? What made this such a remarkable feat? And it's part of what famous building, which is also at least partly shown here. This is another absolutely must-know image. Okay, it was a little tricky fitting both of these paintings on one slide, but they do appear together in a set of image-based questions. So what I'm going to do is review the questions that refer to both paintings together and then show them on individual slides to talk about the questions that refer to the individual paintings. So both artists were interested in using what techniques to depict their subjects. I don't think you're going to find that hard, but I'll give you a hint. Take a look at how the architecture is depicted in both paintings. Okay, who painted the walls of this chapel? Now, warning, this precise image does not appear in your textbook, although it showed up in your podcasts. It may be that it's in a later edition or an earlier edition of the textbook, but at any rate, I'm going to give you a very broad hint. This is the right-hand wall of a chapel, and that's the image that the College Board used. But the painting, The Tribute Money, appeared on the left-hand wall of the chapel by the same artist. The walls of the chapel depict the life of which saint? There are actually a bunch of pictorial clues here, which if you know your Bible, you should be able to figure out. But I'll give you another hint. He's the central figure besides Jesus in the tribute money, and a saint very dear to the people of Florence. They tended to ally with popes who were always struggling with the Holy Roman Emperor, and basically the Pope tended to ally in Italy with the people of the middle class, the Guelphs, whereas the Holy Roman Emperor sided with the nobility that the Republican Florentines were often fighting against. That gets very complicated, but it's another hint. And who commissioned this chapel? Okay, very famous work, absolute must know. So who painted this fresco? What purpose was it intended to serve? This is a painting with quite a specific message. It has to do with the point that the patron wanted to make about where he saw the culture going, where it should go. So what two cultures or philosophical positions did this patron hope to reconcile in this painting? Where is it painted? And be careful, the answer is quite specific. I'm really looking for a room. This, as I said, is another must-know work. Okay, a little harder, I suspect. Who painted this? What period does it belong to? What medium did the painter use? The kneeling figures at the lower left and lower right are, and by the way, I'm looking for a category here, not specific names, so who are they? This kind of content, where figures from different eras appear together in a scene, has a name. It's known as a, we've talked about that too. How does the painter create an illusion of depth? What elements of the painting create a 3D impression? This artist dominated painting in what city? And finally, and this I think is not an easy question, how is the painting composed geometrically? The reason it's tricky is I think there's more than one answer that you could give. I actually don't like the question because I think there's more than one question that might even be considered accurate. But the hint I'm going to give you is there is a particular kind of line that really dominates the painting. Notice how your eye is led from the figures on the left up to the Virgin and Child, how she's off center. What term would you use for that kind of line? Anyway, very broad hint there. Okay. How are the figures in both of these paintings portrayed? Look at the bodies, the play of draperies over the body. What are we seeing here that represents Renaissance development? I don't think you're going to have a hard time coming up with the right answer. A central figure in both paintings, again, besides Jesus, is what saint? Okay, here I'm going to give you the entire question. Think about it and do some research if necessary. Both works have all of the following except chiaroscuro, that's the contrast between light and dark to create volume. Placement within a larger program or cycle of paintings. Using the same painting medium. And finally, multiple vanishing points. One of those is not like all the others, to quote Sesame Street. One of those is incorrect. I think you can figure it out, but you may need to do a little work. Okay, now I'm going to look at the paintings individually. What compositional technique does the artist use to tell the three parts of this story? And this is one where you really should know the story. You could be asked questions about that. And here's our other painting. Sorry, a little blurry when it was blown up. Who painted this work? Whose authority was this painting intended to uphold? This painting was one of a few at this era that represented, one of the first actually I should say, that represented a shift in the artistic geography of the Renaissance. In the early Renaissance, one city had dominated. As we move into the high Renaissance, the center of Italian art shifts to, fill in the blank. What kind of architecture is featured here, if sometimes imaginatively? And be careful here, but my recommendation is that you study the architectural works on either side of that imaginary temple. Look at the structures. They should evoke a particular kind of architectural sculpture that you've seen in earlier units. Well, okay, I've got the double image problem still again, and I'm going to follow the same drill. Looking at the first of the questions that address both images. So the Italian term for the bell tower in both images is? Both structures were begun late in which century? And by the way, be careful here. Remember that while Florence Cathedral's dome is early Renaissance, the cathedral itself is Italian Gothic. You may actually want to go back and look at the section in your textbook on Italian Gothic. These two structures were built in two different locales that can best be described as, and the answer we're looking for is really the kind of political unit that these were. And why did both cities undertake the construction of such massive and imposing cathedrals? Okay, you guys have got to know this one by now, but the structure is located in what city? Who designed the dome? And what is that funny-looking architectural element at the top of the dome? And has a specific name. You need to know that. The College Board didn't ask you to identify this particular image, but I'll tell you that it's the Cathedral of Siena, and that some of these questions, again, refer back to the Gothic architecture, specifically to Italian Gothic architecture. So the portals on this structure, remember what portals are, those doorways, you see the tympanum, but above the tympanum are triangular, what's the term for that? You learned that in the last unit. And then, moving away from Italian Gothic, what elements of this design most resemble French Gothic cathedrals? I think when you see the choices, that one's not going to be difficult, but it would be helpful to know the specific features of Italian Gothic cathedrals, which is why I think you may want to quickly go back and review your Italian Gothic cathedrals. Okay, the image on the left is not from this unit. You've actually seen these questions before. I used these questions earlier when we hadn't gotten to the Renaissance yet, and I'm revisiting them now because in the College Board exam, these two images actually appeared together. So, both works function as, I hope that's a duh, and both works were produced using what method? In other words, what kind of material are these and what method was used to produce them? Okay, to help you identify these works, the College Board did not give you a panel from the work, but I'm giving you one, and you've seen this before. So this work was produced in which art historical period? You're going to need to go back a couple of units for that. Who was the patron of the work? And it pairs what two sources in the panels? And here's our other architectural feature. Which historical period is this produced? Which artist created this work? What artistic development or innovation shows up in this work? And it doesn't show up in the other. So, as I warned, you have lots of image-based questions, 71 altogether. You're going to need to move through the questions fairly quickly, but the pacing is actually pretty similar to what you'll encounter in the actual AP test. So, good luck.